Rain fell in sheets over the muddy schoolyard in Atlanta, turning puddles into tiny lakes and playground gravel into wet, gritty sludge. 10-year-old Elijah Moore limped barefoot across the chaos, his socks torn to threads, toes raw and bleeding from the cold stone underfoot. The sharp sting of gravel bit into his skin, but he didn't cry. He never cried. Around him, children shouted and laughed, darting through the storm like it wasn't even there. Teachers huddled under umbrellas, shouting half-hearted instructions, but none looked his way. Elijah was invisible, just another poor, quiet boy with no jacket, no lunchbox, and now no shoes. He trudged toward the swing set, hoping the cold metal chains would at least distract him from the ache in his feet. Then, from under the awning of the school building, a second boy stepped into the rain, Micah Benson, also 10, with careful eyes and a thoughtful silence that made him seem older than he was. He watched Elijah for a long moment, frowning slightly, not in pity, but in recognition. Without a word, Micah approached, knelt beside the swing, and untied his nearly new white sneakers, still clean despite the storm. Gently, he placed them beside Elijah, stood, and walked back into the rain, barefoot. By the time anyone noticed, he had already claimed he'd lost them playing. The act was witnessed only by an old janitor sweeping rainwater from the entry steps, who paused, eyebrows raised, then returned to his broom, saying nothing. The moment passed, never mentioned again. 2 weeks later, Elijah was gone. His mother had died unexpectedly, and he was moved into the foster system, transferred to a new school in another city. Micah never saw him again. 17 years later, Elijah Moore lies unconscious in a sterile hospital room, the steady beeping of machines, the only proof of life. His face is gaunt, his body frail, and the chart at the end of his bed tells a quiet tragedy: end-stage kidney failure. No family listed, no donor match, no time left. At 27, Micah Benson lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, respected as a quick-thinking, skilled paramedic who remains calm under pressure. But behind the uniform and the heroics is a man who's shut himself off emotionally. Still haunted by the night his younger sister Leah was killed by a drunk driver. He'd tried to save her, arriving at the scene too late, and ever since, he's avoided real closeness, especially with family. Empathy comes easily to him in the field. He knows how to talk to patients, how to keep strangers alive, but when it comes to letting people into his heart, he draws a hard line. His closest relationship is with Pastor Ray, a retired chaplain and longtime family friend who now mentors first responders. Pastor Ray often reminds Micah that helping others is noble, but healing oneself takes courage, to something Micah still struggles with. A few hundred miles away, in a small hospital room in Atlanta, Elijah Moore is living a different kind of quiet desperation. After his mother, Clara, died when he was 10, Elijah was shuffled between foster homes, some cruel and some indifferent, but none permanent. Through it all, he held on to a quiet resilience, shaped by memories of Clara's compassion and the few moments of kindness he received, like the boy who once gave him his shoes. That memory, like a worn photograph, stayed with him. Elijah aged out of the system, earned a scholarship to a local college, and worked as a hospital custodian while studying to become a nurse. He had a plan, a purpose, and for a while, life felt like it might finally give him something back. But a bad fall on the job left him with a severe back injury, and complications spiraled into irreversible kidney damage. Now, unable to work, broke, and mostly alone, Elijah hides the truth of his condition from the few friends he has left, not wanting pity or worry. The only person who knows the full extent of his situation is Nurse Cynthia, a fiercely loyal colleague-turned-friend who refuses to give up on him. She quietly begins searching for a donor, making calls, checking registries, even praying when the data comes up short. Meanwhile, Elijah drifts in and out of exhaustion, writing journal entries and goodbye letters he may never send. Though he rarely speaks of her, the voice of his late mother lingers in his thoughts. Kindness isn't alone. It's a seed, words that fueled his desire to become a nurse, despite having so little himself. While Micah wrestles with emotional scars and Elijah with physical decline, both are good men carrying invisible burdens. One hides behind a career that saves lives. The other faces death alone. What connects them, unbeknownst to either, is time and the cruel race against it. Elijah's doctors give him less than 4 months to live without a kidney transplant. Every passing day is a quiet countdown. One quiet afternoon, while tidying Elijah's bedside drawer, Nurse Cynthia came across a faded 5th grade class, photocreased at the edges and yellowing with time. It was tucked beneath old hospital bills and a half-written goodbye letter, nearly forgotten. Something about the small, unsmiling boy in the back row stirred her, so she snapped a picture and uploaded it to Facebook with a simple, urgent caption: "This man needs a kidney. His name is Elijah Moore. If you knew him, please reach out." Hundreds of miles away in Charlotte, Micah Benson sat alone on his couch, the TV humming in the background, scrolling mindlessly through his phone after a long shift. He nearly skipped past the photo, but something in the boy's face pulled him back. He stared at the image, his heartbeat slowing as recognition set in. It was Elijah, the barefoot boy from that rainy playground all those years ago. The memory slammed into him. The storm, the cold mud, the quiet pain in Elijah's eyes, and the small act of giving away his shoes without a word. Micah had buried that moment under years of grief and duty, but now it came roaring back, raw and unfiltered. He couldn't explain it, but something deep and unresolved pulled at him. Without telling a soul, he called the number listed in the post, disguising his voice and asking how to become a donor for Elijah Moore. The nurse on the other end took his information and ran the tests. Days later, the results came back. He was a perfect match. The news left him stunned. Of all the people in the country, the chances were astronomically land, yet here he was, staring at his reflection in the dark window. Micah wrestled with the growing storm inside. Should he go through with the donation? Should he tell Elijah who he was? Would it even matter to a man who likely didn't remember a moment that Micah never forgot? And if he did remember, what then? For a man who had spent years saving others while keeping himself emotionally locked away, the thought of opening this old door terrified him more than any emergency he'd ever faced. Still, something inside whispered that maybe this was no coincidence. Maybe, after all these years, this was his chance to make something right. Micah continued the donor screening process in secret, slipping away during his off, enduring the blood work, psychological evaluations, and physical tests without ever telling a soul, especially not Elijah. As the medical machinery turned in the background, Micah's mind kept slipping into the past flashes of his sister Leah's laughter. The night he got the call about her crash, the hopeless rush to the scene, the twisted metal, and her blood. On his hands, he had tried everything: chest compressions, breathing, begging, but she was gone before he could save her, and a part of him had died beside her. Since then, every person he saved was a quiet apology. Every emergency was a chance to prove he wasn't too late. Not again. This kidney, this choice to help Elijah, felt different though. It felt deeply personal, like redemption, not just for Leah, but for the version of himself that once believed a small act of kindness could change the world. Meanwhile, Elijah's body was giving up. His strength faded by the day, his skin dulled, and the once vibrant light in his eyes dimmed to a flicker. He began writing letters, final words to people he couldn't bear to burden in life. Some were to former foster parents, one to a teacher who once told him he was college material, but most remained unsent. Nurse Cynthia found a few tucked under his pillow and tried to hide her tears. She was doing everything she could, calling transplant registries, chasing donors, praying, but every door kept closing. When Micah finally approached her in the hospital corridor, not revealing who he truly was, she was skeptical. He introduced himself only as a potential donor who saw the Facebook post. Cynthia narrowed her eyes, unsure if she should even entertain this stranger. But something in his voice, controlled, tired, familiar, made her pause. When he finally told her about the rainy day, about the shoes, about how he hadn't seen Elijah since that afternoon but never forgot, her whole posture shifted. She realized this wasn't some opportunist. This was someone who knew Elijah before life broke him. Still, conflict began to brew from another direction. Micah's estranged father, a distant but stern man, found out about the donor tests after a nurse called their family contact in an emergency. He showed up at Micah's apartment, angry and terrified. "You're all I have left," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of loss they'd both refused to talk about. "Can't bury another child." The words hit Micah hard. For the first time in years, he felt the tug of fear, not just for himself, but for what he might be leaving behind. Maybe this was too risky. Maybe redemption wasn't worth the price. He was on the verge of backing out when Cynthia, still unsure if Elijah would survive the wait, quietly slipped him one of the letters Elijah had written. Micah sat alone that night in the parking lot outside the hospital, reading the uneven handwriting under the dull yellow glow of the dashboard light. In the letter, Elijah wrote, "The only time I felt seen was when a boy gave me his shoes. That kindness carried me through my darkest days. I don't remember his name, but I've never forgotten his heart." The words shattered Micah's silence. Elijah remembered not just the act, but the feeling. That small gesture had stayed with him, helped him survive a world that kept taking. Micah closed his eyes and felt tears sting the corners. In that moment, all his doubt burned away. He knew exactly what he had to do. Micah moved forward with the kidney donation without fanfare, signing the paperwork, undergoing the final tests, and scheduling the surgery, all while insisting on remaining anonymous. No press, no reveal, just the quiet fulfillment of a promise he made as a child in the rain. The surgery went smoothly, and while Micah recovered in a separate ward, Elijah woke up groggy and confused, his body aching but alive in a way it hadn't felt in months. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for so long seemed to lift, though he didn't yet understand why. Nurse Cynthia, holding back tears of relief, entered the room with a small folded note in her hand. She said nothing, just placed it gently in Elijah's palm and walked out. With trembling fingers, he opened the paper and read, "Shoes come and go, but some steps leave a mark. You left a mark on me, MB." The moment the words sank in, Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He blinked rapidly, staring at the signature MB, his chest rising and falling with growing emotion. He remembered, not just the moment, but the feeling. That rainy day, the shoes, the quiet kindness, the only boy who'd ever seen him. His hands trembled as he tried to call Nurse Cynthia, demand answers, plead for contact information, but Micah had already left strict instructions. No calls, no visits, no thank you. He didn't want recognition. Elijah tried anyway, dialing, texting, sending handwritten letters to the address on file, but everything came back unanswered. Days turned into weeks, and Elijah, though still healing, felt a restless ache that medicine couldn't touch. Then, just when life seemed to settle, the twist arrived like lightning. Micah, on a late-night shift, responded to a rollover crash involving a burning vehicle. In a heroic effort to rescue a trapped passenger, he suffered massive head trauma from falling debris. He was rushed, unconscious and bloodied, to the nearest trauma center, Elijah's hospital. As the gurney rolled down the corridor, Elijah, now working part-time in recovery, caught a glimpse of the man on the stretcher. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat before Micah passed out again, but it was enough. Elijah dropped everything, following the team into the trauma bay, refusing to leave. He sat by the window through the surgery, through the hours of silence and uncertainty. After all Micah had done for him, there was no way Elijah would let him face this alone. Micah survived the surgery and the trauma, but the road ahead was long and grueling. Months of physical therapy lay before him, learning to walk steadily, again regaining strength in his arms, and battling through the mental fog that came with traumatic injury. Yet through every painstaking step, Elijah was there, arriving each morning with coffee and sarcasm, refusing to let the silence swallow them. At first, Micah remained guarded, cracking jokes to deflect the weight of things, but Elijah's quiet persistence chipped away at the walls he'd spent years building. One rainy afternoon, while they sat by the rehab center's window, Micah finally spoke about Leah, his little sister, with the bright eyes and boundless energy, and how losing her shattered something he didn't know how to fix. He confessed to feeling like a failure, to believing that if he allowed himself to love anyone deeply again, he'd lose them too. Elijah listened in silence, then told his side of the story, the pain of growing up invisible, the loneliness of foster homes, and how that one small moment on the playground had changed the trajectory of his life. "You didn't just give me shoes," he said quietly. "You gave me dignity. You reminded me I was worth noticing." For the first time, Micah cried without shame, and Elijah didn't look away. In the days that followed, their bond only deepened. They played board games between appointments, traded stories about their childhoods, and found a comfort in each other that neither had known in years. The hospital staff came to expect their laughter echoing down the halls. Eventually, Micah's father visited, stiff and cautious at first, carrying a bouquet of flowers he didn't quite know what to do with. He'd heard of Elijah, but never met him face to face until then. When he saw the kindness in Elijah's eyes, the same quiet strength that Micah had once shown as a boy, he understood. In a hushed moment, while Micah dozed beside them, the old man reached out a hand and said, "Thank you for giving him something I couldn't." Elijah simply nodded. They were no longer two broken men trying to survive. They were healing slowly, together, not alone anymore. A year later, in a bright, echoing high school auditorium filled with restless students and folding chairs, Micah and Elijah stood side by side on a modest stage, sharing their story with a sea of curious teenage faces. Behind them, a projection screen displayed a faded photo of two boys, one in clean white sneakers, the other barefoot in a rain-soaked playground years ago. Micah, now stronger, calmer, and more open than he'd ever been, spoke first. "Sometimes," he said, scanning the crowd, "saving a life starts with just noticing someone. That's all it takes." One moment, Elijah stepped forward next, his voice warm and steady, and sometimes, he added, "You don't repay kindness, you pay it forward. You never know how far one small act can reach." The room fell silent for a breath, then filled with soft applause. In the front row, a boy glanced sideways at his classmate, who sat with his feet crammed into torn, oversized sneakers. Without hesitation, the boy quietly removed his own shoes clean. Nurand pushed them across the floor toward his friend, who looked up in disbelief. The crowd didn't notice, but Micah and Elijah did. They exchanged a look, one of quiet awe, full circle recognition, and something close to peace. The camera lingered on the boy's worn socks, the shoes beside him, the gesture made without fanfare or words. Somewhere deep in the background, Clara Moore's words echoed softly in memory. "Kindness isn't alone, it's a seed." And as the screen slowly faded to black, it was clear the seed had taken root.